Hello, I'm Johann Chacko with the Southwest Initiative for the Study of Middle East Conflicts at the University of Arizona, and welcome to the fourth in our series of SISMEC Presents, a look at the major political conflicts in the region through the eyes of specialists. Today we're with Dr. Charles Smith, Professor of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Arizona. Dr. Smith obtained his MA from Harvard in 1960 and his PhD from the University of Michigan in 1968, where he was a student of Richard Mitchell, who wrote the seminal work on the Muslim Brotherhood. Dr. Smith, in his long career, has published extensively on the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also the intellectual and political history of modern Egypt. He has focused on the interaction between the secular and Islamic strands of thought in Egypt's modern history. And several decades later, and in a new century, as Egypt stands at a new crossroads, this history is particularly relevant. And it might be helpful to look backwards as we look forwards. Dr. Smith, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
People all around the world have been inspired and a few frightened by the burst of popular energy that we've seen on Egypt's streets in the last couple of months. Yet Egypt between 1919 and the early 1950s was an era of mass mobilization and street politics as much as anything else. And this was despite the fact that they didn't have Al Jazeera, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Twitter. How did people mobilize thousands or even millions onto the streets in an era when the government then as now had very tight controls on the circulation of information?
Well, what was interesting, Johann, is that under British occupation even, you had censorship of certain papers. But as a student of ours here, who is now at Cornell University, Ziad Fatmi has pointed out in a recent book just published by Stanford, you had a press that was published in the dialect, and you had nationalist songs that would be sung and plays that would be presented. And so you actually had a form of mass media without all the instantaneous exchanges of views and images that we have now, so that the mass of the Egyptian people, even if they were mostly illiterate, were actually pretty much up to date sometimes on exactly what was going on. You also, by the end of World War I, had a symbol of nationalist leadership in Saad Zaghloul, who became the head of, later on, of the Waft Party, which it still exists in one form or another. And the first major explosion that ignited mass protests in, particularly in Cairo, but then later in Egypt, was when the British exiled him to Malta because they refused to send him to the peace conference. Egypt would not be represented at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. And so once he was campaigning throughout the countryside and the cities to be allowed to go, they exiled him and the country exploded. And you had Muslim sheikhs preaching in Coptic churches, Coptic priests preaching in mosques, women veiled but still marching, et cetera, et cetera. You had this massive outpouring of what we could call Egyptian nationalism, which also spilled over into peasant riots against wealthy landowners in Upper Egypt, in the south of Egypt, and several British troops were killed as well. In the end, the British gave in and allowed Zaghloul to go to Paris, while at the same time making sure that he would never get anyone's audience there. And Woodrow Wilson, the American president at the time, agreed that Egypt would not be heard at the peace conference and the British could stay there. Now, the Waft became the acknowledged leader of Egyptian nationalism, but Egyptian politics was so corrupt during the 20s and into the 30s, with the British controlling things under a so-called independence, but they control the military, they control communications, etc. And some of the actual, what we call secular parties, the leading intellectuals, were in the minority. They opposed Zaghloul, and so they were willing to play ball with the king or with the British to limit the Waft's ability to stay in power. So if you had a free popular election, the Waft would win. But most elections were not free. They were manipulated. And when the Waft was in power, it was usually forced out within no more than 8 or 9 months. The only reason the Waft came back in 1936 was that the British wanted to get a treaty with Egypt because of developments that were going to lead to World War II. Italy was in Libya. They had just taken over Ethiopia. Strategically, you had the Palestinian Arab Revolt about to explode. You wanted an agreement with the Nationalist Party. So by this time then you made an agreement with the Waft that gave Egypt much more independence than it had before. But by this time you had new developments. The Muslim Brotherhood had been formed in 1928. You had street politics exploding in the 1930s, particularly in the major cities. Not so much the Brotherhood at times, but you had the blue shirts. They were emulating Mussolini, these various colors of shirts of different parties, particularly Young Egypt. The Zionists had done this beginning in the later 1920s with Beitar, the right-wing revisionist movement. Menachem Begin, future Prime Minister of Israel, was one of the heads of the black shirts of the Zionist youth group that began in Eastern Europe and then later came over to Palestine. And the brothers were not that active, but then became much more active as the later 30s went on. So you begin to have street politics of a certain type, with also some major, by this time, Coptic Muslim tensions of sorts. The Waft was the only party that really smoothed over these tensions. You had a Copt being the number 2 man in the Waft party for many years, Makram Abeid. And that's something that's been quite alarming about what has happened recently, just in the last few days, where you had demonstrations a few days ago where people were holding up these very large crosses in Maidan Tahrir Square, Liberation Square, and then you've had attacks since then.
Right, on call.
And I'm wondering if there was not some deliberate provocation, not so much by the Egyptian Copts who joined in the initial demonstrations, by some troublemakers who raised the question of the Muslim Brotherhood trying to take over. I see some outside influence there. But you had, particularly in the major urban centers, a great deal of activity, but it was split. It was factionalized. In the 1940s, the main focus was getting rid of the British, who remained in occupation of the Suez Canal zone technically until June of '56. But you had the Muslim Brothers with their rover squads quite active in the 1940s. You had Young Egypt. You had just general nationalists, young nationalist groups. You had communists. And all these groups, many opposed to each other, all agreed that they wanted to get the British out of Egypt.
Right.
But they had no agreement whatsoever on what type of government
what should follow.
Although many of them wanted full democracy and free democracy, and that meant getting rid of the king. Now, what's very interesting, Max Rodenbeck just had an article in the latest New York Review of Books where he notes that the demonstrations in Cairo this year began on January 25th.
Right.
Which is known as Police Day.
Police Day.
Police Day, yes. Yom Police. But this is something that recalls an event in January of 1952 on the 25th when police in the Suez Canal zone, Egyptian police, were surrounded by British. And the Waft Minister of the Interior encouraged them to resist when they had no chance. And they were all killed. And as a result of that, the Waft was discredited. You had massive riots in Cairo, mainly inspired by Young Egypt, we think, not by the Muslim Brothers. And much of westernized Cairo, downtown Cairo, theaters, etc., including Shepherd's Hotel, were burned to the ground.
Yes.
And people were killed. People went into the Gezira Club, where no Egyptians were allowed, and dragged Europeans out and killed them. And it was as a result of these events of June 25th, 1952, that you finally have the king and some of his ministers trying to look into the young officers because they knew this conspiracy was underway. They were unsuccessful, so in July of '52, you had the Officers' Rebellion that brings Nasser, Sadat, and all these other people into power. And Egypt is then ruled by military officers ever since then.